afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Asian Initiative Lecture Series. My name is Amanda Wan, and I'm the founder and coordinator of the Asian Initiative Lecture Series at the Institute of World Politics. For those who are new to the Institute of World Politics, IWP is a graduate school of statecraft, national security, international affairs, and intelligence. We have a doctoral program as well as 5 master's programs and 18 certificates of graduate study and a continuing education program. The objective of this lecture series is to broaden the scope and discussion on a range of intelligence, foreign policy, and security issues attendant to the Asian geopolitical, socioeconomic, and cultural spheres of influence. Today, we have Dr. Mark Clifford, who will be presenting a lecture on his book, Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World. Dr. Clifford is the author of Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World, and the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Hong Kong and a BA from the University of California, Berkeley. A Walter Badgett Fellow at Columbia University, he lived in Asia from 1987 until 2021. Previously, Clifford was executive director of the Hong Kong-based Asia Business Council, the editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, and publisher and editor-in-chief of the Standard in Hong Kong. He held senior editorial positions at Business Week and the Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong and Seoul. He has won numerous academic, book, and journalism awards. Thank you, Dr. Clifford, for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. I'm delighted to be here and to be giving this lecture about my book. I will talk for less than 60 minutes. I've been allotted 60 minutes, but I think I'd like to allow as much time as possible for questions. We have, I guess, around 100 people taking part in this live webinar, and I'm sure many of you have questions and probably comments and are also expert in some of these areas. So I'm going to share my screen. Whoops, that is not, there we go, I think. Let's see. Yeah, yeah, this is this is me. The book is Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World, and the subtitle is deliberately provocative: What China's Crackdown Reveals About Its Plans to End Freedom Everywhere. I'm mostly going to talk about Hong Kong, but I'm also going to talk about Hong Kong as a template for what I fear is Beijing's its inclination, its desire to impose its authoritarian values wherever and whenever it can throughout Asia, and indeed throughout the open societies throughout the world, open and closed societies. Yeah, here is how to reach me. The contacts are also going to be at the end of the lecture. So I'm, and here's the cover of the book, of course, which I hope that some of you will have a chance to look at or to engage with, or at least engage with the ideas, because I think that the challenge that China faces, and indeed, you know, we're speaking on this very poignant day where Russia has invaded Ukraine. I'd say the challenges that authoritarian countries, notably China and secondarily Russia, pose to freedom everywhere are quite formidable. This is the organization I'm with, the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, and I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about really my personal journey in what's happened over the last couple of years for me personally in the context of Hong Kong, because I went during this time from being an observer, a foreigner, obviously, in Hong Kong, a journalist for most of my career, to someone who unfortunately was caught up, really felt the sharp end of Chinese power as it really crushed Hong Kong. And that was in my capacity as an independent non-executive director at Next Digital, a media company that published the prominent pro-democracy newspaper, Apple Daily, which was forced out of business under circumstances that I'll talk about more fully later on last June. So the key points that I'm making. I'm going to be making most of them implicitly, and I'm going to be making them mostly in the context of Hong Kong. But I'll refer to them throughout the slideshow and the talk. But I want you to keep in mind these are the big points. I think China is determined to reclaim a commanding position in the world. Think back 220 years at the beginning of the 19th century. China was responsible for 1/3 of the global economy, 33%. That dropped to just a couple of percent during the Maoist period, and that sort of was the low point of a decline that lasted more than 150 years. And Hong Kong really played a central role in the disruption of the pre-existing world order, one that saw the Qing Empire humbled, uh, defeated in numerous wars, subjected to what the Chinese call unequal treaties. I think that's quite a fair description. And the takeover of Hong Kong, the seizure of Hong Kong, and its establishment as a British colony in 1841 was really very much part of that process, and it occurred in the context of an opium war, two opium wars, and the establishment of the special administrative region of Hong Kong as part of China in 1997 represented a historical return for China, and I think a very important moment in Chinese history where China could feel that it was reclaiming its sovereignty over its territory. And I'll try to find some time to talk about Taiwan, because that, of course, is the one remaining part that China is determined to get its hands on and exercise sovereignty over. Point number one, China is determined to reclaim this prominent position in the world economically. As I said, it went from 1/3 of the world economy in 1800 down to a couple of percent in the 1960s. And now it's at about 1/6 of the world economy, 17, 18%. May have grown a little bit more during the pandemic. China's growth has been stronger than most of the rest of the world's, of course. So China is well on its way to reclaiming a very important position, if not the largest economy in the world yet. It's still quite a bit smaller than the U.S., although there are signs that it will overcome that. And I think with this more important economic prowess will come growing political and of course, military might and power. And my concern is that China wants to use that power to impose its brand of authoritarianism wherever it can. So point number two, the Chinese leadership sees the current moment. They see unique historical circumstances. They see a period of strategic opportunity that will allow it to accomplish this goal. And under Xi Jinping, it's prepared to take big risks. I think it's important to remember that Xi Jinping is a risk taker of a sort that we don't usually see among leaders of large global powers. Again, it's very poignant to be delivering this lecture on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, the first invasion that we've seen in Europe since 1945, since the end of World War II. So I think, unfortunately, we have a moment right now on the world stage where two large authoritarian countries are led by men who have a real capacity for risk. And so far, Xi Jinping, at least, has gotten away with the risks that he's taken. He's militarized the South China Sea, despite promises to President Obama that he would not. He has presided over a crackdown in Xinjiang that has seen, let's say, 1 million or so Muslim Uyghurs put into re-education camps, but whatever you want to call them, they're prisons. And this represents the largest incarceration of a civilian population since the Nazi period. I mean, just think about that. We don't know if it's a few 100,000 or more than 1 million people who are there at any given time, but the numbers are staggering. In any way you look at it, it contravenes international law, and it's an internment on a large scale of a civilian population. And of course, Xi Jinping has presided over a crackdown in Hong Kong that, well, until the invasion of the Ukraine, was I think the only instant I can think of in modern times, certainly since 1945, where a free, prosperous, peaceful city was essentially destroyed in terms of its freedom and its liberties. And I think even the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe in the 1940s was in the context of occupying Soviet troops after 1945 and the defeat of the Nazis. So I think what's happened with Hong Kong, the destruction of a free city that posed no threat to China, is something that should be very worrying to all of us. And again, a real cause for concern at a time when Russia also is so aggressive. So with those 3 points in mind, let me move on and talk a little bit about how I went from being an observer to a participant over the last couple of years, and talking about some of the people that I worked with and where they are now. This is Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is somebody that I've known since 1993. This, unfortunately, was August 2020 outside his house in Kowloon, just off, on Kadoorie Avenue, in a leafy, tranquil enclave above the very crowded district of Mongkok. Jimmy was being arrested for it wasn't the first time. I think it was the second time that year. And he was very publicly being humiliated, I would say. This was during COVID. There were supposed to be social distancing measures in place, and yet the pictures as he's being led out of his house, being manhandled, being, grabbed by the police, I think showed the degree to which the Chinese authorities, and when I say Chinese, I really mean the people in Beijing, in Zhongnanhai, the Chinese authorities were determined to destroy Jimmy Lai. Today, I'll fast forward a little bit. Spoiler alert: Jimmy Lai he's 74 years old. He's a diabetic. He's a devout Roman Catholic. He's always preached nonviolence. He's a man of peace. In fact, many of the student protesters in 2019, and throughout the last 10 years or so, thought he was far too moderate. His generation hadn't really accomplished anything. So it's ironic that he's emerged as what the Chinese call a black hand and the leader of a new gang of four, which is, again, ironic given the fact that he's a man of peace. But the same day that this happened, about the same time, 200 and odd police came into the Next Digital headquarters. So this is where Apple Daily newspaper is or was published. It was founded in 1996 and 96, 95. So it had been publishing for a quarter century when the Chinese authorities decided that what it was doing was illegal. And again, let me just fast forward a little bit. So this was August 2020, shortly after Chinese authorities imposed, without Hong Kong's consent, a national security law that essentially said anybody who criticized the authorities could be sent to jail for the rest of their lives, without trial, without bail. Now, there are a few things around that. Obviously, it's a little more specific. Secession, subversion, collusion with the foreign powers were all outlawed. But in fact, the law means whatever authorities decide it should mean. So, for example, there's a speech therapist who was a co-author of a children's book that featured sheep and wolves. She's now in jail on national security law charges, denied bail, no trial in sight, let alone a conviction, because she wrote a children's book that features sheep and wolves that was deemed to contravene, perhaps, the national security law. So despite the fact that there are constitutional protections for Hong Kongers, free speech, freedom of assembly, all these nice freedoms that we enjoy in the West, and the right to be presumed innocent until convicted, the right to have bail, all of these are being denied to national security law defendants. So I don't have pictures of the next time the police came into the office, which was last June. But this time they sent 550 armed police, treated the Apple Daily newsroom like a crime scene, and took away a number of people. Jimmy Lai was already in jail at that point. In fact, he's been in jail for about 15 months now, since December 3rd, 2020. and except for a couple of days at Christmas time that year under house arrest. And they took away the chief executive officer, the CEO, who had been the editor-in-chief at Apple. They took away the editor-in-chief. And by the time the dust had settled, 7 of my former colleagues, so I was on the board of directors, 7 of my former colleagues were in jail. In fact, they're still in jail. And other than Jimmy Lai, who has been convicted on some very minor civil disobedience charges that before the national security law came into effect and before Beijing really cracked down on Hong Kong, these sorts of charges would have been, if he'd even been prosecuted, which would have been unlikely. There were things like lighting a candle. He wouldn't have, if he had been prosecuted, he would not have gone to jail. And he's serving 20 months right now on civil disobedience charges. But the other 6 of my former colleagues, the editor-in-chief, the former editor-in-chief, former CEO, a number of editorial writers and editors and journalists, they're just sitting in jail, denied bail. You know, their trial date seems to be shifting around and never really happen and gets pushed back, because they were just doing their job as journalists, as media workers, just as they had done for 26, they and their colleagues had done for 26 years at Apple Daily. So all of a sudden, what was just normal behavior in Hong Kong, normal free press, open society, was deemed illegal. And it's, you know, it's one thing to talk about these things, it's all very abstract, but when you're on a board of directors and your colleagues are being marched off to jail, not to be seen again, forced to resign, the company's thrown into chaos, because on top of jailing my colleagues, the authorities, the then Secretary for Security, John Lee, said that he had, quote, reason to believe, just those 3 words, reason to believe that 3 of our subsidiaries had violated the national security law, including Apple Daily, the newspaper, and the website. So because of that, our bank accounts were frozen, so we had to throw almost 1,000 people out of work, and the company had to shut down. I mean, we couldn't get permission from John Lee, who's now been promoted to the number 2 position in Hong Kong, the chief secretary. We couldn't get permission to pay our staff. We couldn't get permission to pay China Light and Power, the electricity company. We couldn't get permission to pay the phone company. So John Lee put us out of business, all very legal, all completely legal under the new national security law. But he put us out of business because he decided he didn't want us in business. He had reason to believe that we had violated a law so vague that you can lock up speech therapists for writing illustrated children's books. I mean, it's a kind of Alice in Wonderland meets Franz Kafka meets George Orwell. I mean, it's really too horrible to comprehend, except when you think about the actual individuals that I've known who are in jail, and there's scores of them, who, you know, ranging in age from their teens to, you know, Jimmy Lai in his 70s, most of whom haven't been convicted, who are really being held, I would say, on completely bogus charges. So that's how I went from when I started this book, having recently done my PhD in Hong Kong history at Hong Kong U, as Amanda said. I wanted to try to write a longer history of Hong Kong's politics, because it's often said that Hong Kong people don't care about politics, or that this is all a kind of CIA British, plot, kind of leftover from colonialism, and that, again, Hong Kong is a business city. All people care about is money. And that's emphatically not true. So what I'm going to do now is, for most of the rest of the time here, is to walk you through a series of photos that are from 2019, mostly. Some of them go back to the handover in 1997. And I'm going to sort of jump around a little bit in history, but I think it's just nice to, for you, the audience, to have a vivid sense of some of the scenes of Hong Kong around the time of the handover and beyond, but especially during the demonstrations in 2019. So this is the evening of June 30th, 1997, right around midnight, I guess. Must be just after midnight. The Chinese flags are now raised, the Hong Kong flag on the left, the Chinese flag, of course, with the 5 stars next to it. And behind it, of course, the big Chinese flag and the UK flag. This ended 156 years of colonial rule by the British. From the British standpoint, and from the standpoint of probably about 6 out of 10 Hong Kong people, maybe a little bit more, it was a pretty good period in many ways. It wasn't perfect. I mean, it was a colony, right? That had to end. It was often a racist kind of place, filled with social snobbery, but it was above all a place that had a sense of fairness, a sense of liberty, a sense of freedom. It was not democratic. I mean, elections were limited, but it was a place where there was at least a semblance of rule of law. There was good governance, good administration, very little corruption after many years of being very corrupt. But the last 30 or so years of British rule, 20 to 30 years, saw a real cleanup. It was, of course, a major international financial center. So I think, people greeted this moment with trepidation, of course, because many of them or their parents had fled communist Chinese rule. Jimmy Lai, for example, came to Hong Kong at the age of 12 in, I guess, 1959 or 1960. He was an illegal immigrant. He hid himself in the bottom of a fishing boat, of a sampan, and made his way to Hong Kong. Became a child laborer, worked in a factory, taught himself English by reading a dictionary, and like so many other Hong Kongers of that time, scrambled up the ladder and found a great deal of success. He owned a textile mill after some years. He then branched out downstream into retailing. He started a fast fashion company, Giordano, that was a kind of H&M precursor, or Uniqlo. And then around the time of 1989 and the killings in Tiananmen Square, in and around Tiananmen Square on the night of June 3rd, morning of June 4th, Jimmy Lai became radicalized, like many Hong Kongers, and realized that the Chinese takeover that was going to happen just 8 years later really needed to be resisted. And he started first a magazine, and when I met him, he told me about his plans to start a newspaper, and that was Apple Daily, which started in 1995. So by the time this handover came, there was pride, of course, among many Chinese, among many Hong Kongers, that their country would be Chinese again. It wouldn't be ruled by some people from halfway around the world who'd colonized it. But there was also, of course, a lot of trepidation. And I think this picture with the Chinese military led by the People's Liberation Army, I think captures the moment. I should also mention that the flags, which are flying so smartly on the left, are an artful charade. A friend of mine was involved with rigging up the fishing line that made it look like they were snapping smartly in the wind. It was, of course, inside in a convention center because it was raining. But that, I think, sort of sums up some of the theater and the pageantry. So I'm going to show a few more photos from around this era. This is also from that night. This was, I think, early the next morning, when the PLA troops came into Hong Kong for the first time. Very, very old truck. I think they've really upgraded their military gear since then. And you see, of course, a lot of people are waving. They're waving Hong Kong flags, but I think these people, I can't say for certain, but many of these people were put up to it by local pro-communist organizations, United Front work group organizations. But again, I think there was a genuine feeling of pride and of hope, and thinking that, well, maybe China had changed. Maybe the promises that China made to Hong Kong, that it would enjoy a high degree of autonomy for 50 years, that it would be able to keep its way of life. The mini constitution that China promulgated, which promised freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of worship, the right to be considered innocent until proven guilty, the right to a fair trial, the right to a jury trial, all these things that have now been eviscerated under the national security law, or at least curtailed, were promised and were hoped for. This was the last governor. I'm going to show you a few pictures of him. This is Chris Patten. I mention it only because he obviously was cut from different cloth from many of his colonial predecessors. He was the first retail politician to serve as Hong Kong's governor. It was a historical quirk of fate that he ended up with the job. But Prime Minister John Major, who had been angered by what he regarded as humiliating treatment that was meted out to him in Beijing when he became the first Western leader to visit the Chinese capital after the Tiananmen killings in fall of 1991. Patten lost an election. He was available for the job, and I think Major wanted the British to go out proudly and wanted them to go out feeling that they had done their best to establish what they could of an open, free, and democratic society before China took over. And I should say that not all of Major's predecessors felt that way. Margaret Thatcher would have liked Hong Kong to be independent and fought for British rule to continue after 1997, but was rebuffed by Deng Xiaoping. But despite Thatcher's fervent anti-communism, her concern for the people of Hong Kongers were not even included in any of the negotiations between the British and the Chinese. I mean, it really was a colonial possession whose fate was decided between two powerful countries. But I think Patten brought a very, very different sensibility, and it's one that was in marked contrast to the people who followed him after 1997. So here he is playing ping pong out on the street. I don't think any of his predecessors or any of his successors would have ever been playing ping pong. And I don't know, but I imagine that young boy on the left probably was thrashing him. But which again, he was a good sport. In that previous picture, he was eating egg tarts, which are a Hong Kong specialty. But he used to go on unscripted walkabouts and just talk to people and meet people. And again, this kind of retail politicking was very different from his predecessors, but also set a very high bar for those who followed him. Nobody who's followed him has been able to do that, has felt really secure in going out and meeting people. A final shot of Patten. This is after he left. You can see just and I saw this when he came back, and I interviewed him when he was giving a talk at Hong Kong U about 20 years ago, and just the affection that the crowds that just ordinary people had for him was really quite extraordinary. And I've met all four of the chief executives who followed. Nobody had anything like the kind of popular appeal that Patten did. So let me fast forward. This is 2003. This was a protest, obviously, in the heart of Hong Kong. You can see the trams. It's near Victoria Park, and it's the protesters are walking about 2 miles down to the central business district, where Government House, where the administrative offices were at the time. The basic law that was the mini constitution promulgated by China didn't just promise Hong Kong people all the rights that I mentioned before, but it also imposed a number of obligations on Hong Kong. And among them was the necessity to introduce national security legislation. Now, of course, every country has national security legislation, and no one would say that's a bad thing. What people in Hong Kong did fear was that national security legislation would be drawn and would be implemented in such a way that it would threaten their way of life, their freedoms. And as we've seen from these last couple of years, that was a correct interpretation. In 2003, when the first attempt was made to introduce national security legislation under so-called Article 23 of the Basic Law, people made their opinions known, and we had something like 500,000 people come out on the streets. This was not unprecedented because at the time of the Tiananmen killings in 1989, so still under British rule, there were crowds of this size on one or two occasions. But this was the first large-scale demonstration after the reversion to Chinese rule, and I think was a real shock to Beijing and to the leadership in Hong Kong, who I think were and are very out of touch with the feelings of the Hong Kong people. And so this was a real surprise. had major political repercussions, and eventually saw the resignation of the first chief executive, Teng Chihua, purportedly on health grounds, although he's still going strong almost 20 years later, and the resignation of several key ministers. I also think, in retrospect, it's clear that it woke Beijing up to the fact that Hong Kongers were not universally, or even in significant numbers, welcoming the return to Chinese rule. I really honestly think that Beijing didn't understand the quest for freedom that people in Hong Kong had, the concern they had about China's authoritarian system being imposed on Hong Kong, the worry of the midnight knock at the door. I mean, the great thing about Hong Kong is it was a city that was an enclave. It was the only really free city in China. It's the only place that the commemorations of Tiananmen Square every June 4th could take place until, well, 2019 was the last one. And I think that the Chinese deluded themselves into really believing that there was this kind of the kind of Chineseness of Hong Kong would overcome its I guess, like, open society, its freedom loving aspect. And I think what 2003, this demonstration on July 1st, 2003, 6 years to the day after China took over, what that showed was that China had not won the hearts and the minds of Hong Kong people. So I'm going to skip forward a few years and go on to some other pictures of demonstrations here. This is 2012. The guy in the center is Joshua Wong. He has emerged as one of the I think, most forceful advocates of democracy in Hong Kong. He's in prison right now. At that time, he was 15 years old. So he was born in, I'm trying to think if I've got my math right here, but he is leading a protest against an attempt to introduce so-called patriotic education into the curriculum, which is essentially communist ideology and history. He was born just before the handover in October 1996. So he's one of the generation that I think that the Chinese just imagined would grow up feeling very Chinese, very attached to the motherland. And yes, Joshua Wong is very Chinese, but he's more attached to freedom and to the values, the core values that he grew up in Hong Kong as an open society, than he was to the communist version of Chineseness. And so, I mean, it's remarkable that this guy at the age of 15 started leading these protests, and he got 50,000 people out for some of them, some evenings, and the government had to back down. The woman on the left is Agnes Chow. I think we'll see another picture of her later on. This whole group of teenagers, of people born around the handover, who don't even remember the British period or the colonial period, they actually emerged as far more forceful advocates for democracy and for Hong Kong than, say, the generation of Jimmy Lai, who, as forceful and as committed as they were, they weren't as radical and as committed to taking action as Joshua Wong was and is. This is that same year. This is some of the students protesting against the patriotic education curriculum. So, pretty good for a movement that was spearheaded by a 15-year-old. This is the so-called umbrella revolution, umbrella movement, Occupy Central of 2014. Joshua Wong, whose picture you saw, was a couple years older by that point. I think he was, he would have been 17, I guess, when he led the occupation, just short of his 18th birthday. When he led a group over a fence, and they occupied a part of the government headquarters, and just actually very bad policing ended up bringing people out in the streets and seeing tear gas and police violence of a sort that hadn't been seen since the colonial period, since the 1967 Cultural Revolution, when the leftists rioted and set bombs off in the streets of Hong Kong. This was a peaceful, nonviolent uprising. It did severely disrupt Hong Kong for 79 days. This area between Central and Admiralty near the new government headquarters was occupied. It obviously brought traffic to a standstill on those streets, and it was wonderful that it ended peacefully. It was unfortunate that the government, faced with a kind of outpouring that it had seen in 2014, chose not to negotiate, chose to wait the protesters out and then crack down and arrest many of them afterwards. So I think there's actually a kind of continuity between 2014 and the much more militant street tactics that we saw in the Occupy Central movement and 2019, and you'll see a lot of pictures of 2019. So Hong Kong protests went from being incredibly peaceful, where people from, you'd have babies in backpacks to people in their 80s, and there was still that aspect of it. But as we'll see, beginning in 2014, but certainly in 2019, there was a much harder edge to the protesters who were extremely frustrated at Beijing's unwillingness to keep its promises under the basic law. And I mentioned freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, right to be considered innocent, right to a jury trial. But there's one other really important thing that's worth underscoring, and that's that Beijing had promised Hong Kong a path to universal suffrage. What that really meant was that Hong Kongers were promised that they could elect their mayor and their city council. The mayor equivalent is called the chief executive. The city council is the legislative council. This was supposed to happen, during the after the Chinese handover, sometime during these 50 years of promised high degree of autonomy in the special administrative region. But the expectation was it would happen in 2007. The basic law allowed a kind of 10-year cooling off period, but everybody, pro-Beijing people, pro-established people, business people, government people, before 1997, the promise, the mantra always was, in 2007, you'll have universal suffrage. Well, 2007 came and went, no universal suffrage. By 2014, it was clear that Beijing was really dialing back its promises for universal suffrage. It's an open question as to whether or not they ever really intended to implement universal suffrage. I think they actually would have liked to if they could have been confident that they were controlling the outcome. In other words, that the political parties were in a narrow enough spectrum and were essentially pro-Beijing so that Beijing could be comfortable with the outcome. It really was not comfortable with an open and democratic society as part of China. And that's unfortunate, because I think that has, ultimately that this lack of trust, this lack of faith in the Hong Kong people has caused Beijing to react in ways that have ultimately, are on their way to destroying Hong Kong. So this is 2014, Occupy Central, 79 days of, not all pitched street battles, but pretty intense political confrontation right in the heart of Central. This is Joshua Wong on the left and Agnes Chow on the right. It's I show you these pictures only to give you a sense of, try to give you put some faces behind these names. I mean, it's often very abstract to be talking about big political movements, but these are basically kids. They were teenagers. They were, trying to work for what they believed was good for their society. We could argue as to whether or not they did everything perfectly, or whether or not they were naive or too idealistic. But change is often led by people who are in their teens and in their 20s, and they took seriously what China had promised. And I don't think that people like this were an existential threat to China. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping runs China, and he seemed to feel differently. This is another picture from 2014. I think it speaks for itself. You don't have permission to vote. I like it because it shows, I think, some of the wit and the humor. And in 2014, we saw an incredible creative, artistic outpouring among the people who were camped out along the streets for those 79 days. And I think the umbrella movement gave lie to the notion that Hong Kong people only care about money. They don't care about politics. They have no artistic or creative interests. I mean, that might have been true of the generation of refugees from the 1950s and 60s who needed to worry about a roof over their head, but it certainly wasn't true of the people that came up in Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow's generation. They grew up in a more affluent time, and they were well educated. They were educated in liberal studies. They were taught to think for themselves, and they did. This is the official narrative. This was 2017. I think you see the kind of difference between Chris Patten's era and Xi Jinping, who stands on the right, and Carrie Lam, who is the fourth chief executive, being inaugurated on July 1st, 2017. She remains the chief executive. She's coming to the end of her first term. It's unclear whether or not she'll have a second term. Chief executives in Hong Kong are permitted 2 5-year terms. Nobody's made it 10 years yet. And we can get into this in the Q&A, but I think the pandemic in Hong Kong and the alarming rise in COVID infections is really causing concern among Xi Jinping and among Carrie Lam. This is Margaret Ng, who was another of the older pro-democracy activists. She's a barrister. She was convicted on civil disobedience charges recently, but on account of her age was not sentenced to jail. I have this picture partly to show Margaret, who's, in any other society would be like many of these people, like Joshua, like Agnes, like Jimmy Lai, would be regarded as an engaged citizen of the sort that we would commend for being involved in civic affairs. It's also interesting, this is not a stage photo, to see the amount of money that is in the box that she's collecting. It's for Justice Defense Fund, and it's filled with mostly $100 Hong Kong bills, so about $12.70 each. So imagine, some fundraising in the States where everybody's shoving in $10 bills. What's interesting is that the narrative that is spun by the Beijing media is that the CIA, mostly the CIA, funded this uprising, or all these uprisings in 2014 and 2019. One of the amazing things about any of you who have been to Hong Kong political rallies, is that the amount of money that's raised is extraordinary. I mean, people are just stuffing in 20s, hundreds, $500 Hong Kong notes for multiple organizations. You see right behind Margaret, another guy has a box filled with somewhat less money, but the generosity among Hong Kong people for the pro-democracy cause was really quite extraordinary. And I think it's worth thinking about that when one hears news about CIA funding or the National Endowment for Democracy training protesters to rise up, which is again the kind of dominant Beijing line. This is Martin Lee, often called the father of democracy, also like Margaret Ng, convicted on civil disobedience charges recently and not sentenced to jail. Jimmy Lai was sentenced to jail. And Margaret and Martin were not, I think the only ones not sentenced to jail in that trial. This is one of the Tiananmen vigils that was held on June 4th. I think this might be 2019, I'm not sure. But again, I think it gives a sense of the somber, peaceful, commemorative nature of well, particularly the June 4th events in Hong Kong. This, we're now up to 2019. This, I believe, was June 16th, 2019. So as some of you will know, in 2019, Carrie Lam introduced a bill that would have made it, would have essentially erased the distinction in many senses between Hong Kong and China in terms of the legal systems. It would have made it possible for China to extradite people from Hong Kong back to mainland China. Now, it is a little strange, perhaps, that an enclave like Hong Kong could exist with its own legal system, its own legal protections within a communist, dare I say, totalitarian country like China. But that was the case until, well, I guess still is the case. I'm not. The extradition bill has not actually been passed, but I think Hong Kong people felt that if there would be no protection, it would erase the distinction between the mainland and Hong Kong, and mean that if, for example, a businessman were in a dispute with a mainland partner, and the mainland partner were able to prevail on a judge in China to issue an extradition warrant, that person could be whisked off to China, where there was, very little chance of justice, particularly if you're on the wrong side of a powerful, let's say, former business partner. So this galvanized protests on a scale that were even larger than the ones of 2003 or 2014. On this day, on June 16th, an estimated 2 million people were in the streets. I mean, nobody really knows the number. I think the police say a couple 100,000. That's preposterously low. 2 million is pretty high, but it was impossible to count because pretty much everybody in the city, or not everybody in the city, about 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 people in Hong Kong went to Victoria Park and went to Central. And I mean, it was basically immovable. I was observed the end of the march, and the number of people was just extraordinary. You can go back and look at some of the aerial photos, and there are crowds like this stretching for about 2 miles. It was almost beyond belief, and it's even more extraordinary when you think that Hong Kong's population then was just shy of 7.5 million people. Um, for a variety of reasons, the border and the political controls in China, very, very, very few people from mainland China came to this protest. So let's assume there were 2 million people, 7.5 million people in Hong Kong, not drawing from the hinterland, not drawing from the mainland. So that's more than 1 out of every 4 people in Hong Kong taking part. And then for every person who took part, there are probably 1 or 2 people at home who were at least sympathetic. The people of Hong Kong really spoke. They went out in the streets and they spoke. And this was the day after Carrie Lam had said that she wouldn't push ahead with this extradition bill. But by that point, the trust of the Hong Kong people in their leadership, in Carrie Lam and in the Beijing leadership, had broken. Earlier that week, there had been police brutality of a sort that had never been seen before in Hong Kong, and I think that people in Hong Kong were just like really fed up. Most Certainly most democratic countries would negotiate in a situation like this. Even authoritarian countries occasionally negotiate. When I first moved to Asia, I was stationed in South Korea. And I was there in June 1987 when hundreds of thousands of Koreans took to the streets and demanded direct presidential elections because the then ruling president, General Chun Doo-hwan, wanted to put his handpicked successor, General No Tae-you, in power. After weeks of protest, No Tae-you came on and said, "Okay, you win. Here's my 7-point plan. We're going to move towards democracy. You get direct presidential elections." And we've seen how far South Korea has come in 35 years. And it's so sad that Hong Kong's leaders wouldn't negotiate with the people, wouldn't actually give them assurances that they would continue to have the freedoms that they were promised, that they would enjoy a move towards universal suffrage, which again would not be destabilizing for China as a whole. It was electing the mayor and the city council in a far-off place on the southern coast of China, more than 1,000 miles from the capital. The fact that China can't tolerate any kind of dissent, I think is something we should find very worrying. So I'm going to go through a little more quickly some of these shots from 2019, but I think that although the national security law has really beaten down the people of Hong Kong and would make protests like this virtually impossible at this point, it's worth remembering that just less than 3 years ago, we had millions of Hong Kongers out in the streets expressing their views. 100,000 or more have emigrated, have left Hong Kong. But most of the Hong Kong people who are out there are still there. And I think that they they believe in democracy. They believe in an open society. They believe in freedom. They don't want to worry about the midnight knock at the door. And in every election there's been in Hong Kong since 1991, roughly, which is when a real election started, roughly 6 out of 10 people have voted for the pro-democracy candidate. So I think although China has beaten and cowed Hong Kong into at least temporary submission, we have to remember that given the chance to express themselves, the scenes that you'll see in some of these shots, I think, more truly reflect what the people of Hong Kong think. These are, this was one of the Lenin walls, named after John Lennon, which were first in Prague in around the time of the Czech uprising, or well, freedom, I guess, and from the Soviet Union and democracy. And there, you can see all these these little Post-its, basically, with people expressing solidarity with the democracy movement. And these became quite contested, with pro-Beijing people tearing them down as they got support from the authorities. But these popped up all over the city, really quite extraordinary. This really angered China. This was the night of July 21st. This is outside the Hong Kong-Macau Affairs Office, which oversees, which is Beijing's kind of main locus point of power, or was until the national security law came in. And this, of course, is the seal of the People's Republic of China. And I think the sight of what the Chinese leadership regards as this sacred seal, exemplifying the People's Republic of China, being defaced with black paint was, just really provoked anger, and I think was a kind of red line that I think stiffened their resolve to really deal with Hong Kong quite harshly. There's Agnes Chow and Joshua Wong again, a couple years older. Agnes speaks Japanese and is holding a Japanese sign there. Again, just to try to give some sense of the mass nature of the protests. These are healthcare workers who are protesting. You see many of them wearing a patch on their eye. There was a young woman, Indonesian journalist, who was either blinded or suffered serious eye damage as a result of being hit in the eye with a beanbag fired by the police, a projectile. And this was a protest against it. Again and again, credible reports of police violence weren't taken seriously by authorities, weren't investigated seriously. After June 13th, which was really in the first week of the demonstrations, Amnesty International came out with a report, How Not to Police a Demonstration, really calling Hong Kong authorities to task for their very poor and overly heavy-handed reaction to protesters, and things just got worse as the summer went on. And I should say there definitely was a reaction and a counter reaction from the protesters, and the violence really amped up on the side of protesters, as well, as I think you can see from this rather poignant picture. The protesters were obviously better and better armed in terms of the gas masks to deal with tear gas, helmets to deal with projectiles. It's remarkable that so few people died. One person was killed by protesters. In fact, they threw a rock at someone and hit an old man and hit him in the head quite tragically. There's some unexplained deaths. There are some suicides. There's some controversy around some of the police actions, but I really have to give both sides credit for this not being a bloodbath. It wasn't at Tiananmen, and I think China learned something from 1989. This is interesting because in Prince Edward Station, this is an NPR station in Hong Kong, there were beatings by police, and there were rumors that some people were killed. I have not seen any credible evidence to suggest that, but what emerged was a makeshift shrine with white chrysanthemums, which often are put at the shrines, the scene of a death. so there was this anger which developed, well, actually, unfortunately, against the MTR as well, because it was seen as shielding the police. And the videos and the pictures of the beatings that took place in this station on August 31st are extraordinary and very disturbing. These, I think, getting a little closer to the end here. These are just some pictures of. This is obviously an upscale shopping mall, and just filled with thousands of people. The hands are raised. There were 5 demands for full democracy, for investigation into police brutality, and some other demands. And these were a cornerstone of the demonstrators' calls throughout that summer. This is Lion Rock, the iconic symbol of Hong Kong that symbolizes Hong Kong resilience and a kind of can-do spirit. The Lion Rock, kind of era of the 1960s and 70s, when Hong Kongers gritted their teeth and worked hard, forms a really important part of the Hong Kong mythology. And protesters were determined to kind of seize the rock as their own, and there were pro-democracy signs put up there, quickly removed by authorities. Another scene, showing even more people from one of the shopping malls, and again, it's hard to imagine that this was only 2.5 years ago, but day after day, lunchtime after lunchtime, evening after evening, and particularly on the weekends, just hundreds of thousands, millions of people, of Hong Kong people, coming out, asking their government to be accountable, asking their government to investigate police violence, asking their government to stop the extradition bill, asking their government for the democracy, the universal suffrage that was promised to them. No response, just stonewalling. And here's Joshua Wong in prison, or being transferred, I think, to court in this particular moment. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Just short of my hour, and I think we still have about a half an hour for questions. So I think through Hong Kong, we can see the determination of China to flex its muscles and not to worry too much about the international community, the response. Obviously, the US and other open societies responded with various degrees of sanctions and other measures against China and against Hong Kong as a result of the crackdown. But I think that it's Hong Kong today. Obviously, it's Taiwan, if not tomorrow, then metaphorically tomorrow. The one country, two systems model that was supposed to guarantee this high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong for 50 years was in fact originally developed for Taiwan. And it was rolled out first in Hong Kong and then in Macau 2 years later. And the idea was that the people in Taiwan, the compatriots, so to speak, would be able to see just how wonderfully Hong Kong was doing and would want to embrace the motherland. Obviously, that hasn't worked. People in Taiwan want China less than ever. But Xi Jinping has made it clear that he thinks he has a historical mission to deal with the Taiwan issue, and this issue of sovereignty over a place that China's ruled off and on, and not always very closely for centuries is it's something that Xi Jinping believes. We can debate the historical merits of it, but the reality is his policies are developed to get Taiwan back. And I think if we go back to the Thatcher Deng Xiaoping talks back in 1982, Thatcher, I think quite rightly, told Deng Xiaoping, you don't understand Hong Kong, you don't understand free societies, you guys will make a mess out of this. She was a little more diplomatic than that, but not much, being Maggie Thatcher. And Deng said, well, we actually think we understand it pretty well, and we think we can run it and the economy will be fine, but if we can't, we can't. It's going to be ours, and at the end of the day, politics is going to rule, and we have to have control over this. And I think that's the way they've treated Hong Kong, and I think that's the way they're going to treat Taiwan. If they end up destroying the village to save it, so to speak, in other words, if they inherit a wrecked, messed up Taiwan, well, I think so be it. I mean, I think they have made the decision that they want it back. I think Xi Jinping, for the first time, has put a date on. I think it's 2050, might be 2049, which would be the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic. But the clock is ticking. And I think if Xi Jinping has the kind of long life that Chinese leaders often have, he will be, if not formally in power, at least calling the shots behind the scenes for at least a decade, perhaps 2 decades or more to come. I mean, he's in his late 60s. Deng Xiaoping died at the age of 92, just before the handover in February 1997. So I think that we have to take Xi's threats against Taiwan seriously. And I think, again, it's very poignant that we're speaking the day that Russia's invaded Ukraine. But I think that we see that there are people who will wreck peaceful societies for their own reasons. I think the example that Hong Kong provides as a prosperous, free, peaceful city whose liberties have been destroyed is a model for crackdowns that China would like to implement, first in Taiwan. We can talk about other countries where it doesn't exercise sovereignty. But I think that China is looking at Hong Kong. The fear used to be that Hong Kong would become, quote, just another Chinese city. I think it's on its way to becoming something worse, and that's to be a peripheral, troublesome region that needs to be hammered into submission, just as the Uyghur Muslim area of Xinjiang is, just as Tibet has been. And I think that's extremely, extremely worrying for what it says about China's rise in the world and its apparent unwillingness under Xi Jinping to accept a rules-based international order. So I'll leave you with this picture of my colleague Jimmy Lai. I am at the new 1-year-old NGO Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong because I'm lucky enough to not be in Hong Kong. But I wake up and every day I think about Jimmy Lai and the other colleagues who are in jail just for doing what they'd been doing for decades. And it's wrong. I think that freedom and justice ultimately triumph. Tyrannies and autocracies don't last forever. And I'm sorry that Hong Kong is where it is, but I believe in the spirit of the Hong Kong people. All those people, those pictures you saw, they're there. They haven't been brainwashed into submission. So I want to thank you and look forward to taking your questions and hearing from you. If not during this session, then please feel free to get in touch with me later on. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Clifford, for such an interesting lecture, and we'll take questions now. So the first question is, do you think sanctions work for China or Russia with Hong Kong being totally destroyed, Ukraine being invaded? What do you think would happen to Taiwan, and where will Russia and China stop?
Wow, that's a lot of questions. Let's see. Do I think sanctions work? I think that sanctions generally tend to have a greater political and social impact than they do economic impact. Sanctions probably, or serious sanctions could have more of an impact on Russia than they probably would on China. China's a $15 trillion economy. China can do without the rest of the world. China could be shut off from the rest of the world. And in fact, China might want to be shut off from the rest of the world. So that's the sanctions issue. Sorry, the other two questions were?
So with Hong Kong being totally destroyed, Ukraine, being invaded, what do you think would happen to Taiwan, and where will Russia and China stop?
Yeah, well, I don't think Russia and China are acting in concert. So I'm not a Russian expert. I don't know where Putin is going to stop. I think he's going to have his hands full with the Ukraine for some time. So let's just try to stop him. Hopefully, he can be stopped in the Ukraine. I'm terribly concerned about Taiwan. In some ways, it's remarkable that Taiwan has lasted as long as it has. I think when the U.S. normalized relations in 1979, and even going back to 1971, I guess when the People's Republic of China took over from Taiwan, the United Nations seat. I think a lot of countries just figured that Taiwan would just be absorbed into China long ago. The fact that Taiwan has developed into a thriving, robust, and very prosperous democracy is a real challenge to China, because I think it gives the lie to Beijing's notion that Chinese people can't handle democracy, and that if you don't have the Communist Party, then it'll just be chaos. And I think that's a lie, and I think that the people of Taiwan are determined to resist China as best they can. Clearly, Xi Jinping would like to see victory of a sort that perhaps looks a little bit like Hong Kong, in the sense that you don't have a full-scale war. A lot of people don't die. You take over the semiconductor facilities of TSMC, for example, and other things without firing a shot, but that you get Taiwan to submit. I don't know when and how this is going to happen, but I think that the world really needs to figure out how to stand up and confront Chinese aggression. And the irony is that by acting, I think, prematurely and very aggressively, China seems to have, if not united its neighbors against it, it certainly has provoked a response. So you've got the Quad, you have Japan, Australia, India, the U.S., in alliances that are designed to thwart further Chinese ambitions. But it's a very, very tense time. I don't think an attack on Taiwan is imminent, but at these moments of the kind of international chaos, when there's the distraction of one invasion, it wouldn't be beyond a country, a North Korea or a China, to try something provocative in East Asia. So, a very dangerous time.
Thank you. And one of our attendees is saying thank you from Hong Konger.
Thank you for watching.
The next question is one of our attendees. So she has many friends in Hong Kong, and some think that China would not affect business. And she's asking if they're being too optimistic.
I think that's a great question. That's a kind of multi-billion-dollar question. I think China made the calculation that the national security law would affect a relatively small number of Hong Kong pro-democracy activists, dissidents, and that it could be walled off from the rest of the court system, and that international business in particular would still feel quite comfortable. I guess international business, Hong Kong business, mainland Chinese business could feel comfortable. They'd still enjoy a nice lifestyle in Hong Kong, the expatriates, that the courts would still be honest when it came to, and fair when it came to business disputes. I think that's a legitimate point of view. It's very, very hard to dislodge international financial centers, and of course, Hong Kong, along with London and New York, is one of the world's three great financial centers. It's hard to break up and disrupt the kind of networks that are necessary to make a financial center. And so, if it had just been the national security law, they might have had a good chance of success, because I think, let's be frank, I mean, there are quite a few people, particularly foreigners, who didn't like the disruption of 2019. You have a couple million people out in the streets. You sort of worry, are your kids going to be able to go to school? Are they going to be able to get home from school? Can I go to my club? Can I move around? It was really, I think, quite difficult for many people who felt like they had no particular stake in it, they weren't Hong Kongers. But I think that the pandemic has thrown all those calculations put those calculations at risk. Right now, we're approaching. I mean, Hong Kong did a good job, I think, a really good job in keeping deaths very low, and keeping infections low. I think there were, as of a month ago, there were fewer than 200 people who had died in Hong Kong as a result of COVID. I mean, extraordinary, particularly if one compares that to, say, New York City, a city of similar population. But now under Omicron, I mean, the numbers have spiraled out of control, and I don't know the latest, but I mean, we're up to something like, in the neighborhood of 10,000 cases. So the whole strategy of really aggressive contact tracing has completely, been ripped to shreds. The hospitals, the healthcare system is under incredible stress, and the death rate is rising. Xi Jinping took or his advisors took the extraordinary step of using the Dagongbao newspaper, which is controlled by the Communist Party, to send a very public message to Carrie Lam and the Hong Kong government that they had better get their act together and get this under control. I mean, Xi Jinping does not need to use Dagongbao to communicate with Carrie Lam, to put it bluntly. As a matter of fact, he could pick up the phone. He probably wouldn't. He'd have somebody else pick up the phone. But the point is, they're using very public methods to try to get the Hong Kong government to get things under control. This, of course, is a critical year for Xi Jinping. He's hoping to start a third 5-year term, an unprecedented third 5-year term. Nobody since Mao has served more than 10 years as head of the Communist Party and as head of the state. So the last thing he wants is Hong Kong COVID spinning out of control, because the whole narrative of the party has been we look at how great we are. The rest of the world couldn't handle COVID. We can handle COVID, and now they're blaming Hong Kong. It's like, you guys, you're still like a British colony. You're not thinking like us. You're still thinking like your colonial masters. So they're still blaming this really on the British Western way of approaching business. So schools have now effectively been shut down. The summer holidays been brought forward. So March and April, schools will be shut. Vaccination rates are low, particularly among older people. So they're trying to boost those. They're going to test everybody. They're probably going to go into some kind of modified lockdown. So this is a long answer to the question, but I think that this has made it really difficult for non-Chinese businesses to want to be in Hong Kong. So we're seeing people like the big liquor company, Pernod Ricard, is asking its regional headquarters are in Hong Kong, but it's telling its senior executives, you can't be in Hong Kong, because what's the good of being in a regional center that you can't travel from? Because Hong Kong is pretty much cut off from the world now, and because of the long quarantine requirement, the lack of flights. So the short answer to your question is, if it had just been the national security law, they might have gotten away with it. The combination of the national security law and the pandemic means that I think Hong Kong's days as an international financial center are really in question.
Thank you. And there's a comment from one of the attendees. Thank you for an insightful, substantive talk. Would love to hear Dr. Clifford's thoughts at some point in the future on other areas besides Taiwan that China is eyeing for subjugation.
That's a great question. It does have border disputes with many of its neighbors. I think 16 countries border China. It depends how you count Taiwan, of course, and Hong Kong and Macau. But it has hard borders with well over a dozen countries, and it has border disputes with many of those, including Korea, India, of course, where it engaged in the first deadly conflict in decades a couple of years ago. Bhutan, where it's engaging in infrastructure projects that seem to threaten the territorial integrity of Bhutan. Nepal, where it's exercising a very heavy hand. So there's the issue of its neighbors. Places like Cambodia, where it looks like it's building a military base or a naval base. But I think that the broader context is one. So that's the neighbors, and there's a physicality to that and a sovereignty issue. But then I think the broader issue is the extent to which China wants to export its model where it can, particularly in more authoritarian states. And I'm thinking of some places in Africa or Latin America that are happy to take, let's say, Chinese telecom equipment, and often corrupt local elites will work with the Chinese to get Chinese telecom equipment in there, which is often sold at an inflated price, which results in corruption, further entrenches local elites, and results in not only high prices for local consumers, but also allows for surveillance by Chinese and by local rulers. So that's a kind of also a separate issue, but it's part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I think it's definitely something to watch, because China is then using its relationships with many of these countries to get support in the United Nations and related bodies like the United Nations Human Rights Commission. But the issue that I'm more focused on, perhaps being an American living in an open society, is the way in which China is trying to influence and to shape debate in open societies. So it often uses economic leverage to punish countries who do things or advocate policies that it doesn't like. And when that fails, or to complement that, it uses much more muscular, even bullying kinds of tactics. So let me just take a couple of examples. Australia, a couple of years ago, called for a full and open investigation into the origins of COVID. Sounds reasonable, right? I mean, don't all of us as global citizens really deserve to know where COVID came from and how it crossed the species barrier? China said it wanted that too. But China felt that this was an attack on it, which maybe it wasn't. I don't think it was an attack, but I mean, it really was an attempt that if this had broken out in America, I'd like to think that we would, honestly and thoroughly investigate its origins. China reacted by, despite the fact that Australia did what China said it wanted, an investigation into COVID, China reacted by trying to punish Australia in a variety of ways. Notably by cutting off exports of many Australian goods, especially wine, beef, agricultural products, to China. We could go around and we could look at many examples of this. Little Lithuania, which opened a trade office for Taiwan that used the name Taiwan, which Beijing didn't like, was seen as a kind of quasi-diplomatic relation by Lithuania. Which, by the way, has a population, I think, around Hong Kong's. I mean, it's not a populous country. Again, it's hard to see this as any kind of threat to Beijing, but Beijing responded by cutting off Lithuanian exports to China. And it denied that it cut them off, but it just removed the country code and the import classification. So it said, basically, you don't exist. We've literally zeroed you out. Then it went one step further, and it told German automakers and German car component makers, and other German companies, European companies, that they couldn't even use components sourced from Lithuania if they were going into China. I mean, this is in clear violation of the WTO agreements and of any sense of a rules-based international order. But they're trying to bring Lithuania to its knees, and they've actually thrown the EU into, if not crisis, I think into, put the EU in a very, very difficult position. Norway, an independent commission gives out the Nobel Peace Prize every year. In 2008 or 2009, Liu Xiaobo, Chinese poet, dissident, imprisoned at the time, was given the Nobel Peace Prize. China reacted by restricting Norway's exports to China, especially of salmon. It denied the Eurovision Song Contest winner, who happened to be Norwegian that year, or maybe it was in 2010, a visa for China. I mean, it just took a variety of large and small actions. Norway just, kowtowed, did so much for China, but it wasn't until 2016, coincidentally or not, the year that Liu Xiaobo died in Chinese custody, still in Chinese custody. It was only after his death that China eased up on Norway. So we can go on. We look at the US, the UK, the kind of penetration of the Communist Party affiliated, the United Front Work Department, to mobilize Chinese students to oppose pro-democracy moves, to oppose attempts to invite the Dalai Lama on university campuses. I mean, we can go through hundreds of examples of China's attempt to shape the discourse and stop free discussion in open democratic societies.
Thank you, Dr. Clifford. Due to the limited time, we'll just take one more question. So the last question will be, do you think that a new axis of anti-Western powers comprising Russia, China, Iran, etc. is now forming?
I don't think it's an axis. I do think, I've long thought that the Russia-China marriage is one of convenience, but it's turned out to be extremely convenient. has been beyond my expectations. I think given the historical enmity and mistrust between those two great powers, it's not going to stand the test of time. But at the moment, it's very concerning. I know that I'm sure that China is watching the way that the West, the way that the open societies respond to the Ukraine invasion with great interest, because of course what China wants is to be able to take Taiwan and have no more of a reaction than the West responded to Hitler's grab of the Anschluss of Austria, sort of said, wow, that's too bad, and moved on. And I think that's what happened in Hong Kong. I think if that's what happens in Ukraine, it's really, it's obviously very bad for Taiwan. So I don't see an axis. In fact, I think Putin may have misled Xi Jinping. The invasion puts China in a very tough position because they believe in non-interference, and they don't like kind of countries messing around with other countries' sovereignty. But what Putin's done is a very interesting test that China can learn from. Look, Iran is I think these countries are forced into alliances of convenience more than any kind of axis, or let alone an axis of evil.
Well, I think I can take one more question. Is it really possible that Western countries and allies will stand up to China without the buy-in of corporations, which rely heavily on the large market of the mainland?
That is an excellent question, and I think we'll see the answer to that over the coming years. I think it's very hard for corporations to stand up. I mean, take the example of the National Basketball Association, which recently fired Enes Kanter Freedom, a new American citizen from the effectively fired him because he spoke out about Chinese policies. Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets lost his job when he tweeted in support of Hong Kongers. I think individual corporations, even multi-billion-dollar ones, find it very hard to resist the understandable lure of the China market. And I think that governments have to stand up. Governments have to set the rules. Within those rules, let companies do what they like. But if China is intent on being in an adversarial relationship with open societies, it's up to open societies and their governments, our leaders, all of us, really, to set the rules that make it impossible, for example, for pension funds. We have pension fund money from American healthcare workers, policemen, firemen, first responders, that's going into Chinese military companies through U.S. private equity firms, through ETFs and other investment products. And I think we have to start setting some rules that make that impossible to happen. But companies on their own are not going to do it. In fact, especially Wall Street is going to fight the attempt to start separating, start decoupling from China. I mean, of course, this can't happen overnight, but I think we have to start moving in that direction.
Thank you, Dr. Clifford, for such an insightful presentation today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And this will conclude our event today. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.